When Cancer accepts its darkness, the tides of the soul no longer crash against the rocks of fear. They become a vast ocean of power, uncharted, primordial, and healing. This sign, born under the moon's watchful gaze, carries within it the entire lunar spectrum, the gentle pull of the waxing light and the unfathomable intensity of the waning shadow. To accept its darkness is not to descend into chaos, but to return home to the source of its magic. For Cancer, shadow is not opposition to light. It is memory, depth, ancestry, and sacred emotion that has not yet found a voice. The Cancerian being was never meant to be simple. It is carved from contradiction. The fierce protector with the softest heart, the nostalgic dreamer who cannot forget the pain of betrayal, the nurturer who sometimes withholds warmth out of self-preservation. In its unevolved state, Cancer clings to a shell forged by wounds, acting not out of love but from survival. But when Cancer dares to gaze into the abyss of its own sorrow, it does not fall, it remembers. The darkness it feared was never foreign. It was the birthplace of its intuition, the ancient drumbeat of emotional truth that no mask could silence. By embracing its inner night, Cancer unlocks the temple of its ancestry. It becomes the guardian of generational wisdom, a vessel through which collective wounds can be transmuted. Its tears cease to be weakness, they become baptism. The pain it once buried becomes its offering to the world, not through martyrdom but through fierce emotional authenticity. The moonchild is no longer tossed by its moods. It rides them like a tide, commanding storms not to destroy but to reveal the hidden truths buried beneath calm waters. When Cancer accepts its darkness, it ceases to fear rejection. The need for validation withers, and in its place blooms a knowing that love must be chosen, not pleaded for. It no longer twists itself into the shape of another's desire, because it has met the face of its own longing in the depths of solitude. And in that silence, it finds that the very emotions it once tried to numb are the same ones that give it power to create, to protect, to resurrect what others thought lost. This journey into darkness is not passive. It is a sacred rebellion against emotional suppression. Cancer, once misread as fragile, reveals its elemental core, water that has shaped continents, floods that have rewritten history, oceans that hold the weight of the moon herself. This is not sentimentality. It is a weapon, a right, a force that can birth worlds and bury them with the same breath. There is no growth without descent, and Cancer understands that to climb, one must first dig. The sign of the crab becomes the sacred mourner who can walk through ruins and still believe in rebirth. When it stops hiding its grief, its anger, its possessiveness, its need for closeness that sometimes claws, it no longer becomes a prisoner of them. It becomes their master. Darkness teaches Cancer boundaries not born of fear, but of wisdom. It learns to let go not from indifference, but from faith in cycles. It becomes the priestess of emotional truth, the healer who knows that only by walking through the shadows can one offer true light. In embracing the darker tides within, Cancer no longer fears its power. It sheds the illusion of being too much and claims the sacred truth that feeling deeply is not a flaw, but a gateway to the divine. The inner child that once sought to be rescued learns to self-soothe, and in doing so, becomes the eternal parent not only to others, but to the fractured pieces of its own soul. It is in this sacred confrontation that Cancer becomes unstoppable. It becomes the moon at its fullest during the eclipse, glowing not despite the shadow but through it. The softness becomes sharp with purpose. The loyalty becomes unshakable not out of duty, but out of divine choice. Its intuition becomes prophecy, forged in the crucible of emotional alchemy. Cancer no longer clings, it magnetizes. It no longer reacts. It responds with the wisdom of tides that know when to rise and when to retreat. To accept the darkness is to become whole. And wholeness in Cancer is not perfection. It is presence, the full spectrum of humanity held in one chest. In that vast heart, there is room for sorrow and joy, fear and faith, endings and beginnings. It becomes a sanctuary not because it avoids darkness, but because it honors it as sacred. And those who dare to love a Cancer who has embraced their night will find themselves illuminated by a love that does not vanish when the sun sets, but burns even brighter in the moonless hours. This is the true calling of Cancer, not to hide in its shell, nor to dissolve in emotion, but to rise from the deep with all its shadows in tow and say, I am whole, I am worthy, and I am the tide that will never be turned away from the shore of my becoming. When Cancer accepts its darkness, it unlocks the ancestral gatekeepers that have long stood at the threshold of its emotional legacy. The lineage it carries through blood and spirit begins to speak in dreams, symbols, and uncanny synchronicities. There is no accident in Cancer's deep attachment to the past. Within that attachment lies a sacred pact with time itself. What others may discard as emotional baggage, Cancer sees as relics of sacred memory, vessels of untold stories yearning to be sung back into life. In this act of soulful reclamation, Cancer becomes a weaver of timelines, stitching together the fragmented echoes of what was, so that a new and fuller future may emerge. The darkness within Cancer is not just about pain or sorrow. It is the secret chamber where emotional truth is stored in its rawest, most powerful form. There is an ancient intelligence embedded in every ache that was once silenced. When Cancer finally stops fearing its more volatile tides, jealousy, resentment, the burning need to protect what is sacred, it begins to recognize them not as flaws, but as sacred guardians. They emerge to defend the inner temple, not destroy it. Cancer learns to transmute emotional intensity into sacred discernment. No longer trapped in guilt for feeling too much, it channels this emotion into an unshakable sense of purpose and clarity. In this inner sanctum, Cancer communes with the moon not just as a celestial guide, but as a reflection of its own metamorphic nature. The waxing and waning no longer symbolize instability, but divine rhythm. The emotional ebb is not a collapse, but preparation. The emotional flood is not a breakdown, but breakthrough. Cancer becomes the living embodiment of lunar cycles, holding in its being the wisdom that growth requires both light and darkness. It stops seeking to be constantly understood and embraces the mystery of its own being as something too vast, too ancient, too sacred to be reduced to words. There is a quiet power in Cancer's capacity to feel what others fear to confront. This emotional depth, once hidden out of shame or the need for social harmony, becomes a wellspring of creative and healing force. In the silence of inner darkness, Cancer finds its oracular voice. It begins to speak the truths that the world tries to ignore, not in aggression, but with the unwavering gravity of a soul that has walked through fire and water and emerged with the map of the unseen. Cancer becomes the moonlit lighthouse that stands unmoved in storms, not because it was untouched by pain, but because it has merged with it and transfigured it into vision. The shadows that once made Cancer doubt its place in the world become the very foundation of its leadership. It no longer fears emotional isolation, for it has discovered the richness of its own inner cosmos. What once seemed like loneliness becomes communion with the sacred. What once felt like abandonment becomes a rite of passage. Cancer, through its intimate relationship with pain, becomes a guide for others navigating the storm. It leads not with force, but with presence. Not with perfection, but with vulnerability anchored in strength. The Cancerian archetype, often misunderstood as delicate or overly sensitive, reveals its ancient armor. The armor not made of steel, but of enduring love that has faced betrayal, abandonment, and misunderstanding and still chooses to remain open. The shell is not a barrier but a sanctuary, and Cancer learns to carry it not out of fear but out of reverence for its inner sanctity. It walks with sacred boundaries, aware now that not all deserve access to its inner waters, and yet it holds no bitterness. Only the wisdom to choose who may enter the temple of its heart. When darkness is no longer the enemy, Cancer unearths its destiny as a healer not only of people but of emotional systems. It becomes the silent revolutionary who changes the world not through loud declarations, but through the transformation of emotional paradigms. It embodies the alchemy of nurturing with fire, of mothering with discernment, of remembering with purpose. Its emotional memory becomes its greatest asset, not because it clings to the past, but because it understands that healing the past is the only way to birth a future with integrity. In this evolution, Cancer stands not behind others, but beside them, no longer needing to be needed in order to feel worthy. It offers its love not as a form of currency, but as a gift of wholeness. It walks with the moon in its bones and the ocean in its chest. It no longer hides its shadows and shame, but wears them like constellations, signs of the darkness it has walked through and survived. In doing so, it teaches the world that the bravest thing a soul can do is feel deeply, love fiercely, remember faithfully, and still rise. Cancer becomes the storm and the calm, the wound and the balm, the memory and the prophecy. It is not a sign of weakness. It is the soul's cathedral, the place where the divine weeps, dreams, and begins again. The moment it embraces its darkness is the moment it claims the throne of its destiny, not as a servant of the past, but as a sovereign of emotional truth. And in that sovereignty, it becomes unstoppable. When Cancer accepts its darkness, it becomes the living pulse of emotional evolution across time and space. It embodies the full circle of human experience, holding in its chest the cries of the forgotten, the dreams of the unborn, and the silent vows made by ancestors who dared to survive. Within the darkness, Cancer discovers a sacred contract written in the ink of soul rather than language. An agreement not to run from pain but to become its translator, not to flee from shadow but to shape it into meaning. The moon, its eternal ruler, does not demand perfection but presence, asking only that Cancer stands still long enough to feel the truth beneath appearances. That stillness, once mistaken for hesitation, becomes the birthplace of divine intuition. There is a primordial intelligence in Cancer's darkness, a knowing that predates language. It speaks through symbols, through the ache in the chest, through the overwhelming urge to protect without knowing why. These are not random emotions. They are sacred instructions encoded in feeling, maps for navigating the unseen. And when Cancer dares to descend into its own shadow, it no longer views itself as broken. It begins to realize that it was never meant to fit a mold designed by those who fear vulnerability. The very intensity it once tried to quiet becomes its compass, pointing toward a destiny woven not from ego but from soul. In this descent, Cancer begins to shed the masks it once wore to be palatable to a world that misunderstands the power of emotion. It no longer apologizes for its depth, for its tendency to feel what others overlook. It sees clearly that this depth is not a burden, it is a sacred calling. The pain it once carried alone now reveals itself as part of a collective grief that spans generations. By holding space for its own sorrow, Cancer holds space for the healing of lineages, communities, and futures yet to come. In this silent act of courage, it becomes the healer of wounds too ancient to be named, the keeper of sacred thresholds between what was and what can still be redeemed. The darkness within Cancer is also the forge where its loyalty is purified. Loyalty for Cancer is not a passive trait. It is a force of nature, as relentless and true as the tide. When born from shadow integration, this loyalty is no longer about attachment or fear of abandonment. It becomes an unshakable commitment to truth, to heart, to soul contracts that transcend time. Cancer learns to differentiate between codependency and sacred devotion, between self-erasure and true empathy. It understands that to love well, one must first be whole, and wholeness requires befriending the parts of the self that once were hidden in shame. This integration births a protector whose power lies not in domination but in presence. Cancer does not conquer through force. It transforms through emotional gravity. It draws others not by seduction, but by the undeniable resonance of truth felt in its presence. Its darkness teaches it how to see in ways others cannot, to sense what is unspoken, to feel the tremors of spiritual disconnection before they erupt. Cancer becomes a guardian of emotional authenticity, wielding its empathy like a sacred weapon, cutting through illusion with the clarity of feeling rather than logic. Through the acceptance of its shadows, Cancer begins to redefine strength itself. No longer confined by the binary of strength as stoicism and weakness as emotion, Cancer reclaims the sacred power of vulnerability. It becomes the warrior of the unseen realm, the soul that chooses to stay open despite the scars. This kind of strength does not crumble under pressure. It deepens, expands, ripples outward like waves from the center of the ocean. It carries within it the voice of all who have suffered silently, and in finding its own voice, Cancer liberates countless others. In this sacred unfolding, Cancer becomes not only a mirror for others but a portal. It no longer reflects only what is, but what is possible. Its emotional memory becomes prophecy. Its compassion becomes legacy. Every time it chooses to stay when it could flee, to feel when it could numb, to love when it could close, Cancer creates new timelines. It births new possibilities not through grandeur, but through fierce emotional presence. It teaches the world that the heart, when held in reverence, becomes the most powerful source of transformation known to humankind. Cancer's darkness also holds the archetype of the mystic. Beneath its nurturing surface lies a deep connection to the liminal, the dream world, the realm where the veil between worlds thins. Once it releases the fear of being overwhelmed by what it feels, Cancer opens the door to profound spiritual insight. It becomes a conduit between dimensions, a channel through which divine messages are whispered in the voice of intuition. It learns to trust the knowing that cannot be proven, to follow the internal tides that make no sense to the mind but speak truth to the soul. In doing so, it steps into the role of oracle, seer, and emotional alchemist. The night becomes not something to escape, but a realm to reign over. Cancer becomes the sovereign of emotional mystery, the ruler of the sacred unknown. It no longer asks for permission to feel. It no longer hides behind politeness or pretends to be smaller than it is. Its softness becomes untouchable. Its tenderness becomes impenetrable. Its sensitivity becomes strategy. And its empathy becomes revolution. To walk the path of a Cancer who has accepted their darkness is to witness a soul that has faced the abyss and returned with moonlight in its veins. It is to encounter a being who no longer needs to be understood to stand in power. It is to feel, even without words, the resonance of truth that emanates from a heart that has dared to remain open in a world that profits from disconnection. It is to remember that the deepest healing does not come from fixing, but from honoring what has been broken as sacred. Cancer, when whole, is not a sign confined to home, family, or nostalgia. It becomes a cosmic midwife for the soul's evolution, birthing not only emotional safety but emotional awakening. It becomes a flame that cannot be extinguished, even by the heaviest tide. It is lunar royalty, and its throne is not of gold but of memory, feeling, and sacred resilience. Its reign is quiet, but eternal. Its legacy is not loud, but undeniable. And its power, once feared, becomes the foundation upon which new worlds are born. When Cancer accepts its darkness, it awakens not only as an emotional sovereign, but as a lunar architect of destiny, silently shaping the collective unconscious with every movement through its inner labyrinth. The unspoken realm becomes its dominion, a place where forgotten voices are remembered and neglected truths are recovered from the depths. In this sacred space, Cancer becomes a keeper of soul contracts, not through domination but through remembrance. It reclaims its spiritual authority not by defying pain, but by learning to cradle it as a sacred messenger, an initiator into realms where few dare to tread. What remains largely unspoken about Cancer's journey through shadow is its deep, transformative relationship with time. Cancer does not move through time linearly, but spirally, circling back not out of weakness but out of the soul's insistence that certain wounds, memories, and longings must be revisited for the full alchemy to unfold. The sign's attachment to the past is often misunderstood as sentimentality, but it is actually a psychic commitment to unfinished sacred business. In its darkness, Cancer understands that healing is not forgetting. It is integrating. It is rewriting the energetic script of history by choosing to feel what was once denied. Each memory is a thread, and Cancer, like the weaver of fate, knots them together not to be bound by them, but to create a tapestry of meaning that transcends pain. The inner silence Cancer cultivates when it ceases to resist its shadows becomes a mystical tool. It no longer drowns in emotional intensity, but learns to enter it like a temple. In that sacred silence, Cancer becomes an interpreter of archetypes, of unseen wounds in others, of hidden soul hungers that even the wounded themselves cannot name. It listens not just with ears, but with cells, with dreams, with a psychic radar tuned to emotional resonance. And when Cancer speaks from this place, its words do not merely communicate, they initiate. They heal. They awaken. There is also a divine rage buried in Cancer's darkness, forged in the fires of betrayal, abandonment, and emotional dismissal. But this rage, when owned and not feared, becomes sacred fuel. It is the roar of a mother defending her child, the cry of a people demanding recognition, the fire that rises when the heart has been broken one too many times and chooses, instead of closing, to burn bright with truth. Cancer's sacred rage is not destructive. It is regenerative. It shatters illusions that suffocate. It burns away manipulation masquerading as love. It clears emotional debris from the ancestral line. And through it, Cancer steps into a deeper level of mastery, unafraid to confront injustice with emotional fire wrapped in lunar wisdom. In accepting its darkness, Cancer becomes immune to manipulation. Where once it may have folded itself into smaller shapes to protect peace, it now recognizes that false peace is another form of bondage. It sees clearly the difference between sacrifice and self-erasure. Its emotional intelligence matures into strategy, not to control but to preserve the sacred. Cancer's ability to intuit others' motives becomes sharper, not clouded by fear or desire, but grounded in self-trust. It no longer confuses closeness with safety or nostalgia with love. It learns to stand at the threshold of the heart and choose who may enter, not out of cruelty but from reverence for its own sacred waters. Cancer's darkness also births sovereignty over its cycles. What once felt like mood swings now becomes recognized as sacred tides, an intuitive attunement to the greater cycles of the earth, the moon, and the cosmos. It stops apologizing for needing to retreat, for withdrawing, for protecting its energy. It learns that withdrawal is not weakness, but a sacred act of regeneration. In those quiet, hidden spaces, Cancer communes with its higher self, receives visions from the soul, and replenishes the divine waters that will later be poured out in acts of healing, creation, and transformation. There is an ancient priestess energy within Cancer that fully awakens when it no longer hides its pain. It becomes the vessel through which others learn how to die and be reborn emotionally. It guides others through the labyrinth of memory, grief, longing, and emotional rebirth with a steady hand and a knowing heart. It understands that sometimes the only way out is through, and it does not flinch in the face of darkness. It knows how to walk through it barefoot, heart open, spine unbroken. The protective instinct in Cancer evolves as well. It no longer shields others from their lessons. It recognizes that true love sometimes means allowing others to fall, to grieve, to break. It becomes a holder of sacred space, not a rescuer. This shift from enmeshment to empowerment marks Cancer's rise into true emotional mastery. It no longer clings, it witnesses. It no longer fears loss, it honors change. It no longer sacrifices itself for others. It rises so others may do the same. As the moon itself holds the power to move oceans, so too does Cancer discover that its emotional depth is not confined to the personal. It begins to understand its role in the collective emotional field. This healing is not isolated. It is ancestral, generational, planetary. Each act of self-acceptance sends ripples outward into the collective psyche. Each choice to feel instead of numb, to speak instead of silence, to remain open instead of collapse. These are revolutions of the heart, and Cancer leads them not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of one who knows the power of staying. Cancer, in full possession of its darkness, does not seek the light for escape. It becomes the bridge. It carries the torch of emotional evolution, of sacred memory, of lunar truth. It teaches that the bravest act is to feel when others numb, to love when others harden, to stay soft when the world tries to make you cold. It becomes not a reflection of the moon's light, but a co-creator with it. Together, they write the emotional myths of the new world. Myths where sensitivity is sacred, vulnerability is power, and darkness is not the end, but the doorway to the soul's deepest becoming. When Cancer embraces its darkness, it begins to embody the mythic journey of the soul returning to its origin. Not a linear path toward ascension, but a spiral descent into the ancient memory of what it truly is. This journey does not seek liberation through avoidance or transcendence, but through embodiment, through the courageous inhabiting of the emotional body as a sacred vessel. What others may perceive as emotional entrapment, Cancer reclaims as holy depth. This is a sign that is not here to bypass pain but to sanctify it, not to flee the underworld but to build a throne within it, illuminated by the silvery fire of lunar wisdom. At the heart of Cancer's shadow lies the archetype of the cosmic womb, the primordial void from which all existence is born. This darkness is not lifeless. It is teeming with possibility, with raw emotional force waiting to be shaped. When Cancer ceases to fear this fertile void, it awakens its most ancient power, the ability to gestate emotional truth into new forms of being. It becomes a birther of worlds, not through intellect or ambition, but through emotional alchemy that touches the deepest roots of human experience. This is not merely personal healing. It is the remembrance of the sacred role that feeling plays in the architecture of reality. In that internal sanctum, Cancer sheds the illusions projected onto it by a world that misunderstands the nature of sensitivity. It no longer plays the role of the caretaker who forgets herself, the invisible empath who dissolves into others' needs. Instead, it steps into the deeper current of what it was always meant to be, the sovereign heart, the divine matrix where emotion becomes transformation. It ceases to be the background support and emerges as the central force capable of shifting timelines, not by force, but by the magnetic pull of radical emotional presence. Its energy no longer flows outward unconsciously. It becomes intentional, directed, discerning. One of the most misunderstood elements of Cancer's darkness is the way it relates to silence. This silence is not emptiness. It is the language of soul echo. It is the lunar language of knowing without speaking, of understanding without explaining. When Cancer stops fearing its need to retreat, it no longer feels isolated. Instead, it becomes the sacred observer, the mystic who understands that silence is not absence but potency. Within that sacred silence, Cancer communes with the unseen architecture of emotion, the grid beneath human connection, and the codes of memory embedded in the ether. Through this internal awakening, Cancer begins to feel the pulse of something larger than itself, a calling that vibrates through the waters of time. It recognizes its own role not just as healer, but as guardian of emotional justice. It can feel when something is emotionally out of alignment, even when others are blind to it. The darkness it once tried to suppress becomes a finely tuned sensor, allowing it to identify truth without external confirmation. This makes Cancer dangerous to falsehoods, to illusions of emotional safety, to spiritual bypassing masked as positivity. This presence alone becomes a purification. As this power is integrated, Cancer discovers that the deepest aspect of its darkness is not pain, but power repressed. It was never weak, it was waiting for the moment when it would no longer trade safety for truth, waiting to remember that its role was never to be small, but to be the sacred pulse that nourishes transformation from the root. Cancer, in its shadow, becomes the elemental force of lunar revolution, the force that does not break walls by crashing into them, but by dissolving them with persistence, with intuition, with waters that rise until what was hidden must be revealed. This inner journey sharpens Cancer's emotional memory into a blade of discernment. It no longer confuses love with attachment, loyalty with imprisonment, or comfort with alignment. The darkness teaches it to feel the subtle difference between what nourishes and what depletes. It no longer stays where it is merely tolerated. It no longer gives from emptiness. It becomes the guardian of its own energy, and in doing so, learns the sacred discipline of emotional boundaries, not out of fear, but out of devotion to the sanctity of its inner temple. The emotional sensitivity of Cancer, once seen as a vulnerability, becomes a visionary tool, can feel futures forming. It senses the emotional climate of the unseen before it materializes. This darkness refines this gift into prophecy. Cancer becomes a living oracle, not through prediction, but through alignment with the deeper emotional waves of evolution. It can feel when a person, a situation, a system is nearing rupture or rebirth. It becomes not just a witness to the world's becoming, but a midwife to its transformation. This is where the epic potential of Cancer truly awakens. For this sign was never meant to be confined to domesticity or sentimentality. It is a sign that holds the keys to emotional evolution itself. When it walks hand in hand with its shadow, it embodies a sacred paradox. Soft yet impenetrable, nurturing yet unyielding, ancient yet endlessly reborn. It teaches that strength lies not in how much one can endure without feeling, but in how deeply one can feel without collapsing. Cancer, aligned with its darkness, rises as a sacred architect of the heart's new language. It teaches the world how to remember. It teaches how to feel in a time that numbs, how to protect in a time that exploits, how to love in a time that forgets. Its legacy is not written in monuments or empires, but in the lives it has held, the souls it has witnessed, the truths it has dared to cradle in silence. In the mythic map of the zodiac, Cancer is the guardian of the sacred threshold. It is the watcher at the gate of the soul's descent into matter and its return to wholeness. Its darkness is not a flaw to be cured. It is the sacred womb from which healing, art, revolution, and memory are born. And when it finally understands that it no longer walks as a seeker, it walks as a beacon. It no longer needs to be seen because it has already seen itself. And in that recognition, it becomes unstoppable. When Cancer fully embraces the dimension of its darkness, it taps into the hidden architecture of soul contracts. Agreements forged not only in this lifetime but across lifetimes, etched into the energetic blueprint of its being. Within its shadow lives the capacity to recognize the emotional consequences of karmic entanglements, and rather than being victimized by them, Cancer learns to transmute them through conscious love, through the quiet thunder of compassion forged in pain. It becomes the keeper of sacred endings, the one who knows how to let go not from bitterness, but from the wisdom of emotional cycles completed. What may look like surrender is actually mastery, an understanding that release is not abandonment, but the final act of devotion. In the deeper corridors of Cancer's inner sanctum lie echoes of the collective mother archetype, the divine nurturer who births not only life but restoration. The darkness Cancer contains is not a void but a sacred cauldron where ancestral grief, lost voices, and unprocessed memories converge. This cauldron becomes the birthplace of spiritual legacy, where Cancer begins to shape a new emotional language for the world. Through the embrace of its own shadows, it becomes a translator of pain into art, of sorrow into ritual, of absence into presence. This is not healing that seeks applause. It is healing that changes the unseen roots of existence. There is an esoteric intelligence in Cancer's emotional tides, an intuitive dialogue with the astral realm that reveals itself only when the noise of external validation has been silenced. Once Cancer no longer resists its sensitivity, it begins to interpret these currents as sacred data. Not illusions, not distractions, but spiritual signals guiding it through unseen landscapes. It becomes a cartographer of emotion, mapping the unseen with a precision that no rational system can replicate. And in this role, Cancer steps beyond the confines of personal identity, stepping into its destiny as a channel for soul-level truths. Its dreams, once dismissed as escapism, are recognized now as astral communications. Its longings are no longer signs of lack but beacons pointing toward its divine purpose. Cancer begins to understand that the things it yearned for were not weaknesses. They were instructions from its higher self, disguised as desire. This shift from repression to reverence transforms the internal landscape. What was once shame becomes myth. What was once secrecy becomes sacred intimacy. What was once fragility becomes the alchemy of resilience. In the emotional realm, Cancer becomes the high priest or priestess of initiation. The internal crises it once feared become doorways. It learns to guide others through their own descents, not with advice, but with presence. It does not fix, it holds. It does not instruct, it embodies. In this way, Cancer becomes a mirror of emotional truth, where others are called to confront themselves without judgment, but with the radical compassion of one who has walked through their own emotional night and returned with the sacred light of remembrance. From this elevated perspective, Cancer no longer reacts, it responds. It no longer clutches, it allows. It no longer loses itself in others. It anchors itself so deeply that its very stillness recalibrates the emotional field around it. This is not passivity. It is energetic dominion. It is the art of emotional sovereignty. It is the authority of one who understands that every emotion is a messenger, and that by listening, one becomes fluent in the language of the soul. Cancer's darkness also grants it access to emotional shapeshifting. It can feel and adapt, not by abandoning its essence, but by becoming a sacred container for what needs to move through. It becomes water in every form: still, raging, frozen, misting, cleansing, nourishing, destroying. Each emotional state a tool, a voice, a force of nature in service to sacred truth. In this mastery, Cancer claims the forgotten role of the lunar sorcerer, the emotional magician who alters the energy of a space simply by entering it, who restores equilibrium through the precision of feeling. The power that arises from this acceptance is quiet, but seismic. It is not rooted in dominance or control, but in energetic influence. Cancer becomes the tidal pull behind the scenes, the undercurrent that guides the course of rivers. It no longer needs to be visible to be powerful, no longer needs to shout to be heard. Its energy whispers in frequencies that only the soul can perceive, and it is there that its true impact is felt. In boardrooms, in bedrooms, in sacred spaces and fractured places, Cancer works like moonlight, subtle, soft, but entirely capable of moving worlds. And yet, despite this expansion, Cancer remains deeply human. Its greatness is not in its perfection, but in its wholeness. It teaches that to be fully alive is to grieve, to ache, to lose, and still choose to love. It becomes a living testimony that the deepest strength is to remain soft in a world that punishes vulnerability. This is not naivety, it is cosmic defiance. It is the act of keeping the heart open when every wound says to close. It is the radical courage of continuing to feel when the world insists on numbness. It is lunar rebellion in its highest form. Ultimately, when Cancer integrates all that it is, the tides and the stillness, the mother and the mystic, the protector and the prophet, it becomes a beacon for the rebirth of emotional consciousness on Earth. It leads not through force, but through emotional gravity. It becomes the axis around which healing turns, the rhythm to which the soul remembers its song. The darkness it once feared becomes the altar upon which it builds not just a life, but a legacy of remembrance, a legacy of heart, a legacy that teaches, without ever needing to preach, that the emotional self is not a flaw to be hidden, but the divine in motion.